State Voices. She's been the CEO for 2 years, and prior to that, she directed Wisconsin Voices, leading voter mobilization and registration work through the table of nonprofit organizations in Wisconsin. And she also worked with foundations for a good chunk of time at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. So we've got a pretty terrific crew. And I'm going to ask we're not going to have opening statements per se, but I'm going to ask a question to each person to let them talk about the things that are most important. So we'll start with David Becker. Listen, you've closely followed and commented often, seen you on CBS, on the major changes of the voting process that were made as a result of the pandemic. Can you summarize them and what were the major challenges to their implementation?
Yeah, thanks, Miles, and thanks everyone for having me and for being part of this incredible panel of people that I've known for years. So first of all, I want to put this all into perspective. We're going to have held an election where 160 million people turned out, with the highest percentage of voting eligible population voting in this election that we've ever had since universal suffrage, since the 19th Amendment. In circumstances where we have foreign disinformation attacking voters through social media and other means, where we have the White House itself acting to delegitimize the process both before, during, and after the election. And of course, during not just a global pandemic, but a spike in a global pandemic. And for all of that happening, things went pretty darn smoothly. I mean, if you think about it, how many times did you hear about long lines on election day? In fact, long lines didn't really come up at all, except for maybe the very first day of early voting when the demand was just incredibly high to participate. We're seeing incredibly transparent processes across the United States run by both Democratic and Republican election officials, where we're able to see vote counting live streamed in most places, where there are an unprecedented number of observers in large sites like sports arenas and convention centers. And this is all happening while democracy itself is still being attacked. And I think what we're going to do, we're going to look back on this election as a masterclass in election administration. We're going to look back on this and say, this is a true, a moment of incredible resilience for America's election officials, both parties, the million people who either are professional election officials or who volunteered to work in this election throughout the country, at great risk to themselves from a health perspective. They were away from their families, they were away from sleep, away from food. And by the way, and I just tweeted about this yesterday because it's something that really affects me personally in a very emotional way. Many of these people are suffering death threats to themselves and their families right now. And this is not just Democrats. This is Republicans. They've sent them to me. I've heard them, and it's shameful. And I just want to put that all in perspective because of the tremendous success we had. I think the changes we mostly saw, I know everyone is well aware of these, are mostly around convenience voting, giving voters options to vote so that they felt safe, that they could vote conveniently at a time of their choosing in a way that made them feel most comfortable. And so many changes like mail voting, the expansion of mail voting, the options for early voting, voting in places like sports arenas, large venues, which I'm very proud to have assisted with in advising LeBron James More Than a Vote initiative. Those were all incredible successes. But I also want to note that many states were already there. I mean, people were taking advantage of these options, but they were largely already there. Pennsylvania passed its mail voting law in November of 2019 before we knew about the pandemic. Georgia has offered extensive early and mail voting for some time. It was just not used as much as it was this year. And I think it's notable in some of the things that we're seeing now in terms of the disinformation coming from the Trump campaign is that a lot of the skew in mail balloting in particular, where more Democrats used mail ballots, which were counted later in some states like Pennsylvania than other places, they really have no one to blame but themselves. They really just need to look in the mirror. This was an option that had been widely used by both parties throughout history. In 2016, 2018, almost exactly even numbers of Republicans and Democrats used mail voting. In fact, it skewed probably slightly Republican as it skewed slightly older and was disproportionately used amongst white populations. And so to see that radical change, which did indeed happen, where Republicans opted out of a choice that was available to all other voters just because of things the president said, untruthful things the president said about mail voting, created a dynamic that we're seeing now, which was that the ballots were counted a little bit later, but over the course of maybe Wednesday and Thursday, we started seeing that those ballots skewed very heavily towards one candidate. So I think the options that we've seen, despite some of the rhetoric coming out of some partisans right now, are here to stay. They were incredibly successful. And most importantly, what we've seen over the course of history in election administration is that voters get to choose. They get to decide how they like to vote. And voters, when they're given options, they like it. And it doesn't really matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats or white or people of color or young or old, they like options. And that makes a lot of sense. And so we're seeing that play out. And to be perfectly honest, also, election officials like options because it spreads out voting over a long period of time, so we don't see the voting on election day. And then campaigns have always liked these options. It's just something, again, we've forgotten in this odd campaign environment with the Trump campaign this year. But campaigns have always used mail-in early voting to whittle down the number of people they needed to reach out to on election day to get them to turn out. And that's a huge advantage to a campaign. It doesn't really matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. So I think these are here to stay, and we're going to keep seeing them, especially given the fact that, objectively speaking, this was probably the most successful, accessible, secure election in American history, and we did it during a global pandemic.
Great. Thanks, David. Let me just check one statistic with you. I think I saw that somewhere around 57% of the votes that were cast altogether were cast by mail-in. Do you have that figure?
So I don't have the exact figure on mail versus early. I know that the early and mail figures together were slightly over 100 million, which will end up being about 62, 63% of maybe 64, 65% of the total number of ballots cast. It's remarkable that we probably saw about 60 million, maybe just a shade under, people vote on election day, which was the lowest number of people who voted on election day in years and years in a presidential election. And yet we still saw by far the highest turnout we've seen in a federal election ever. And we beat turnout in 2016 by probably 20 million eligible voters.
Kristen, let me come to you next. So the Lawyers Committee, I've followed its work for a very long time, has been at the forefront of dozens of suits protecting the right to vote and pushing back against attempts to suppress it and discourage it. What were the main categories of what you would call, of attempts to discourage voting, especially in communities of color, that you witnessed during the 2020 election?
Thanks for that question, Miles, and thank you for creating this space for us to debrief and reflect on the 2020 election. And great to be here with such an extraordinary group of colleagues who've been on the front lines of important work to ensure that this is an election season that could work amid the global pandemic.
Kristen, for 1 second, just to welcome Alexis, who has joined us. I introduced you and said you might be a few minutes late, but here you are. So Alexis Anderson-Reed is here with us, everybody. Sorry, Kristen, back to you.
Good to be here.
So yes, my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, brought lots of litigation, but we were not the only ones. And I'll just observe that I think that, just to kind of pick up on where David left off, that I think that a combination of extraordinary litigation efforts to beat back the unnecessary and burdensome barriers that voters faced during the pandemic, combined with tremendous advocacy and organizing efforts carried out by folks like Alexis, voter education work carried out by folks like Dave, and important legal work, legal advocacy work carried out by folks like Chiraag. The whole combination of these efforts, I think, helped to really empower voters to have their voices heard in advance of Election Day, easing the burden, easing the otherwise tremendous burden that officials would have faced on Election Day itself, and contributed to this being a relatively speaking successful election season. Some of the suits that we brought tried to deal with things like access to absentee voting. It's remarkable in this country that your ability to vote during the pandemic had so much to do with just what state you lived in. We've got many states that automatically give everyone access to absentee ballots. And then we've got states like Texas and Tennessee that restrict unnecessarily those who can vote by mail. And so we worked very hard to try and level the landscape to give people more access to vote by mail. And we had some successes in some states, and in other states, we're dealing with increasingly hostile courts when it comes to voting rights. And so victories at the district court level were in some instances reversed at the circuit court level. Other barriers that we sought to deal with were things like notary requirements and witness requirements for voters. And it is remarkable. In some states, you can get your absentee ballot, put your date of birth on the ballot envelope, sign it, or whatever the state requires, drop it in the mail or at a drop box, and you're done. And in other states, voters literally, amid the pandemic, had to track down a public notary who could affirm their ballot before it could be counted, or invite two people into their home to witness their ballot. We also sought to deal with officials that resort to minutia, frankly, to reject ballots. States that have a history of rejecting absentee ballots if somebody doesn't, provide 4 digits of their date of birth and they only provide 2 digits. Or states where officials, though not properly trained, will reject a ballot because they claim that the signature provided on the ballot didn't match the signature that's on file with the office. And in those instances, we fought to ensure that voters would get notice and an opportunity to cure those minor issues before officials would take the extraordinary step of rejecting a ballot that they know is being cast by an eligible voter. So those are some of the ways that we use litigation to try and open up access. And I think that, again, the reason why we saw 100 million Americans participate in early voting and participating through vote by mail was because of the tremendous efforts made to use work inside and outside the courtroom to really empower voters and give them more options this season. The last category of barrier that I'll talk about are drop boxes. We also fought, particularly because of the challenges with the US Postal Service, to push states to not restrict counties, for example, to having only one drop box option for voters. In states like Ohio and Texas, this proved incredibly burdensome and discriminatory. You had population centers that are home to large numbers of voters of color and low-income communities, where people literally had to travel tremendous distances to access one drop box, where officials chose unnecessarily to put those kinds of barriers on the books. Other states were very reasonable and had many drop box options to really just complement the array of possibilities for voters to register their voice this season. So those are some of the ways in which, Miles, we use the courts to try and just give voters more options, given the unique moment that we were up against in 2020.
Great. Kristen, thanks. That was excellent. Chiraag, let me go to you. I know Demos, in addition to doing the legal work very closely with grassroots organizations to push back hard against purging, improper purging, and other attempts to limit the votes. How do you think the fight back went overall, and how would you build on what Kristen has already said?
Yeah, thanks, Miles, for that question. It's really a privilege to be here with my colleagues. We all have worked closely together over the years, and especially in this cycle. And I'm also glad to have this time to reflect. The baseline when I think about this conversation for me is that we have too many barriers to vote. I just want to be clear about that. So you're hearing a lot of good news, but we started in a bad place. When you look back at the 2016 election, there were 86 million eligible voters who didn't participate, who didn't vote. 66.5 million of those voters were not even registered. And those numbers are disproportionately voters of color and low-income voters. So that's a sign of an unhealthy democracy and the fact that we have a lot of work to do. And we have signs of healthy democracy as well. And you're seeing the folks who are directly involved in that on this call. And we did make some progress this year. I want to echo what Kristen said about the civil rights community and voter engagement groups having a significant impact on this election. There's at least a two-part story here. There's the election officials who were heroic, to David's point. I think absolutely we should sort of dissect everything that happened this year and understand how they, against the odds, had significant success. Without massive federal funding that was needed given the pandemic, they were able to pull off this election. But it's also the civil rights community and voter engagement groups that were pushing them, that were out in the streets, that were going door to door, that were adapting to kind of remote strategies to get people registered and to get them returned. One way to think about this for me is thinking about the primaries versus the general. There's significant progress that was made because of the efforts of all of those officials from the primaries to the general. Think back to where we were when the pandemic first took root early in the year in March, and then in the following couple of months, voters were unable to safely cast their ballots in Florida, poll workers not showing up because it was too dangerous and thus polling places being closed or lines being long, faulty new voting equipment in Georgia, long lines that the world saw in Wisconsin with thousands disenfranchised, many people who didn't get their ballots in time to cast them, their mail ballots in Wisconsin. A cumbersome vote by mail process in Ohio with multiple mailings back and forth between the voter and the state that led to dismally low turnout in that state. That's one where Kristen and I sued together, didn't get the relief we wanted, but I think some lessons were learned there for the general. The general did go much better. And I'll give a few examples. One, poll worker recruitment was terrific. And who gets credit here? Many people, but certainly LeBron James's organization, partnering with folks on this call and elsewhere, so More Than a Vote, the Power to the Polls work, any number of grassroots groups who won't get credit, but really deserve credit for making sure that young people and voters of color, people of color, including many people who are too young to vote, signed up to work the polls. Purges is another area where I think we had some success. A coalition of our organizations fought off a law in Indiana that would have allowed people to be purged from the rolls without notice. That was a big win. Another version of this was of seeing progress here was fighting off right-wing attempts to purge the rolls through litigation. There was just a cascade, a sort of torrent of litigation filed, in particular in counties with high Black and brown voting populations, in Michigan and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and elsewhere, to try to use the courts to engineer voter purges. And we were able to fight those off as a community. We didn't see the kind of purges that they wanted to accomplish. Organizing to help people cure their ballots was also successful. I think a lot of success there in Florida. There was just an enormous effort to contact voters who had signature match issues and to get them to fix their ballots in time to be counted. I'm really eager to see what the rejection rates on mail ballots look like when the experts have time to dig into that. I'm hoping they're lower than in the past when they have been disproportionate for Black and Latinx communities. And then really creative voter registration efforts, using the NVRA to get state agencies to register voters, offering voter registration opportunities through kind of the automatic renewals of Medicaid benefits and SNAP benefits. There were millions of additional voter registration that were offered because of activism and activity of legal and base building organizations. At the end of the day, there were still significant hurdles. Kristen mentioned some of them, right? The limitation of drop boxes in Texas and Ohio, I think, are at the top of that list. Florida's Amendment 4 fiasco, disenfranchising more than 1 million people by requiring them to pay their fines and fees, so they just couldn't participate in this election. And again, disproportionately Black and brown voters. David talked about the kind of misinformation and disinformation and voter suppression efforts that were coming straight from the White House. I mean, there's a lot that we still have to work on. I think the takeaway is two for me. One, Black and brown organizers made a huge difference to this election. To me, that's evident from the close margins and the level of voter activity in states like Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so I'm really eager to hear from Alexis about her work and what she saw. The other takeaway is that we had this high voter turnout in spite of continuing voter suppression and obstruction. And we've got to take that seriously. That means structural democracy reform at the federal and state level to take down the barriers to the vote that persist. Thanks, Miles.
Chiraag, thank you. That was a quick whirlwind tour of a number of the points of contention. Actually, before I introduce Alexis, who I have the pleasure of working with at State Voices, the organization that she's heads, and I'm on the board of. There's another group of unsung heroes that and that is the people who over the last 20 years have fought for all of the different ways and different options for people to vote. Yes, there are lots of continuing barriers, but think about same-day voter registration, which is now in 23 states, automatic voter registration, which has gained a lot of ground and made a big impact. Early voting was not an option in many, many states. And this year, I think it was over 40 states where people could vote early in person. And of course, all the mail-in options that were part of the pandemic. But as David said, some states were using well before the pandemic. So I think that all of that is also a testament to the organizing work that has been done to try to open up the process. And I'm proud to be with 4 of the leading practitioners of that opening up process here today. All right, Alexis, so let me ask you a question, which is that obviously you were heavily involved in the mobilization efforts. And it seemed to me that despite the curveball that COVID threw into the process, in March and April, there was a lot more grassroots mobilizing and more funding available to it than previous years. Is that the case? Tell us how you saw it as somebody who was in the thick of it.
Yeah, definitely. So good to be here with y'all today. Sorry I was a little bit late. We were having a conversation around everything that's needed in Georgia right now, which maybe we'll be able to touch on in this call. But thanks, Miles, for having us, and good to be here with everyone. So first, I just want to say, like, everybody's lifting up how successful this election season was. And it didn't always feel like that. This year was a roller coaster. I mean, that's an understatement, right? And at State Voices, just to set a quick context, we are a permanent progressive ecosystem in states. And so we work on year-round civic engagement. And I think it's important to say that because as I'm talking about us, or the we, right, I am talking about State Voices, but we work with 800 organizations across the entire country. And so, it is because of our collaborative work that we are seeing these successes that have been lifted up. The beginning of 2020, we had no idea what we were in for. We had set out in the beginning of the year to contact 30 million voters, to register 2 million voters, and we had made a promise to move $2 million to the ground. So, our plan was to mostly do this through in-person, through site-based, through canvassing efforts, through some digital mobile outreach, but most of it was in person. And we had also hired all of our canvassing teams up to that point, purchased all the data and technology platforms that we were going to use for this effort. And as we know, March, it changed everything. We quickly realized that we had to shift everything. All of our programs had to be remote. That meant digital, text messaging, more phone banking, more mail contact. And as time went on, we knew that vote by mail may be the primary or only way at that point that people could vote. So we had to educate tens of millions of voters in this new way of voting for so many people. We also, at the same time, had to figure out how to take care of our people, right? We had hired up all these canvassers. We didn't want to let people go be without healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. Also, like, so many folks were hurting, right? And so we had to figure out how to shift our programs while also putting our values and putting people first. And overall, we were really concerned about our ability to reach voters, to register voters, and that it would, drastically decrease our ability to do this, because most of the data and the experiments we have done up to this point have shown us that in-person voter registration was the most impactful. So what did we do? Technology, we brought a new data and digital technology, from new text messaging platforms to digital ads to, new ballot initiative and vote by mail tools where we're actually able to help track people requesting their mail ballot. We tested over 40 new data platforms and then rolled out 14 new tech tools in 2020 alone. But that wasn't enough, right? We had to then train people in organizations on how to use these new digital tools. We trained close to 5,000 people in organizations on the use of these tools and how to incorporate them into their programming. We acquired more than 100 million new mobile numbers. This is significant because mobile became the main way that we were communicating with people. I'm sure everyone out there received dozens of text messages. I know I did, but I just was like appreciative. At least we were reaching people, right? But we acquired numbers of young people, of unregistered people of color, of all unregistered voters, which helped the entire ecosystem contact voters who we were not able to actually previously reach even before the pandemic. We're seeing that we still have to dig into the data, but we're seeing that about 30% of the voters that we've contacted were new voters, right? We also shifted to how we talked about voting, to large scale voter education campaigns that included making a plan to vote. And again, some of y'all probably received that. How do you make a plan to vote? There's 3 options. You could vote by mail, early in person, vote on election day. And then like I said, we took care of our people. So we kept on all of our canvassers and made a commitment. We were not going to let people go. We had to shift to remote work. So that meant we actually had to purchase mobile phones for people, purchase tablets, computers, hotspots for thousands of people to do that work at home successfully. We implemented mutual aid programs in communities to help provide, food and PPE supplies while also engaging with them on the election. We had went down to a 4-day work week and provided flexible scheduling and, a new wellness program and mental health support. And so, what was the impact of all of this? I'm so proud of all the work that all of us have done on this call and like the, hundreds of organizations coming together and thousands of volunteers around the shifts that we made. And we have seen the largest voter turnout, at least in my lifetime, right? In most of our lifetimes. We ended up contacting more than 65 million voters, more than doubling our pre-COVID goals. We registered more than 2.3. We ran our largest voter protection program in our history. We moved more than $10 million to the ground, right? More than quadrupling our efforts. And so we still have to dig into some of this data and figure out like what that means, right, for our work moving forward. And I hope we're able to dig into some of the lessons learned. And I really want to be able to dig into the impact that like Black and brown communities and young people had on this election because they were the decisive voters. And I think there's a different narrative that's bubbling up. And so I hope we have a chance to dig into some of that. But I'll end there and just say, like, we were able to take care of our people and live our values while still having a huge impact. So both can be done. And I'm just so proud of the, hundreds of grassroots organizations, state-based organizations, national organizations, because this really was like an all hands on deck moment and effort.
Great. Well, thanks to all of you. This is, it certainly gives me a huge amount of pride to be part of what I think of as a democracy movement for this country, and also lots and lots of work to do. Let me mention to the audience, we have the Q&A. We've got a couple of good questions in there already, but please, if you have questions, keep going. I'm just going to ask quick follow-up questions to each of the panelists, and then we'll go to the audience questions. David, I want to follow up with you about the Postal Service, because, there was a time during the campaign where it looked like, the entire mail-in system was going to be undone by the changes in the post office. And there was enormous pushback against it, a lot of publicity, a lot of pressure on Louis DeJoy to backtrack from what he had done. What's your sense of and then it's sort of like the commentary about it sort of dissipated. What's your sense about how the U.S. Postal Service and the changes there ended up impacting this?
Well, I think the changes, I'll be honest, I'm probably in the minority here. I think that I think that what was happening to the Postal Service was it was real, but it was also possibly overstated. but it was helpful to be overstating it because it trained voters and educated them about their options so they could navigate it no matter what the status of the Postal Service was. I think the most troubling thing that happened wasn't necessarily the things that happened within the Postal Service, and certainly I was very troubled by some of the personnel, the overtime rules, the transportation rules that did actually have an impact on postal deliveries overall, not just ballots. But I think the fact that the letter in late July was sent out by the Postmaster General, kind of preemptively warning election officials that they might not be able to do the job that they had done for 150 years in delivering ballots in a timely way was very troubling. And you saw election officials from both parties push back very hard against that. I think it had this net positive effect. I'm not saying that was positive, that was very negative, but there was this great response from the democracy ecosystem as we're talking about it, from lawyers, Chiraag and Kristen, from people who worked in communities and grassroots like Alexis, I mean, to really educate voters, hold people accountable, hold systems accountable. And what we saw was voters in unprecedented numbers voted by mail, but did it really early. They dropped their ballots off in drop boxes and didn't give them to the Postal Service because they viewed them as untrustworthy. I will tell you, we all remember the Pennsylvania lawsuit pre-election, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court held that they were going to allow mail ballots to come in for 3 more days after Election Day, even though the statute seemed to require them to come in on Election Day. And the U.S. Supreme Court tied 4-4 and left that order in place, but there's still some uncertainty about what the Supreme Court might ultimately do about those ballots that came in on the 3 days post-Election Day. But here's the thing that's most amazing. Only about 10,000 ballots statewide in Pennsylvania came in those 3 days. And they are not going to change the outcome of that race. That is an incredible success story for election officials, for advocates, for activists, for community organizers, for lawyers who worked in Pennsylvania specifically and all over the country to make sure that voters would navigate this process no matter how difficult the challenges, the barriers put in front of them. That's remarkable. So I'm actually someone who thinks mail voting is not a magic wand. I wrote an op-ed back in March that said mail voting is not going to fix this whole thing. We're going to need a lot of options for voters. Mail voting can be challenging for people who don't vote by mail often or who are infrequent voters, because almost all of the verification of eligibility that is done on a statewide basis is left to the voter in a mail voting context. Whereas if they vote in person, there's a back and forth with an election official that can resolve a lot of those challenges. So I was worried about that to some degree, but again, a tremendous success of voter education from a lot of different players in the space to educate voters about what they needed to do to fill out their ballots properly, to get them in a timely way well in advance. And that's why we saw over 100 million people vote early in this election cycle.
Great. Kristen, I have a follow-up question for you. This is interesting that there's clearly a theme emerging here, which is on the one hand, barriers and structural problems and efforts at voter suppression, and on the other hand, an overwhelming, kind of positive organizing sense. Particularly thinking about the African-American voters and other voters of color. What's your sense? Did the suppression, which one in that contending of forces, do you think that the African-Americans were able, in terms of turning out to overcome those barriers? Or do you feel like there's actually a lot of voters who never made it to the polls?
Yeah, so this is a bittersweet story. It's a story that ends well, but we cannot gloss over the tremendous obstacles that voters faced and endured this season. I just want to piggyback off of a observation that David made. I will say I disagree on the USPS. I do think that the changes under Postmaster General Louis DeJoy were dramatic and alarming, and that we were able to get the Postal Service back on track by mounting litigation late in the summer that pushed Louis DeJoy to reverse some of the most devastating changes that he was making to the Postal Service that I think were clearly intended to hijack vote by mail this season. So that's kind of one piece. It was a combination of litigation and tremendous public outrage, right? You have people all over the country talking about mail that ordinarily takes 2-3 days to deliver, all of a sudden taking 10 to 12 days to deliver. So I do think that that's a big kind of piece of the picture, but something that we were able to kind of sort of get under control. But now there's this story about 150,000 ballots that may not have been delivered on time. There was tremendous advocacy and efforts to empower voters so that they were aware of their options, but it is intolerable and anti-democratic and unacceptable that in 2020, we had Black voters and voters of color standing in lines that stretched for hours in places like Philadelphia and Atlanta and Milwaukee and Houston. Throughout either the primary and or early voting season. I think about these lines of Black voters at a polling site in Georgia. The line stretched for so long that by the end of it all, people were in pouring rain because they never imagined that they would be out as long as they would, and that the weather would literally change on them before they could cast their votes. So it's a story that ends somewhat well, but as Alexis was noting, it was a roller coaster, and an ugly, bitter roller coaster, through the very end. And a roller coaster that frankly hasn't quite ended yet because of these post-election litigation efforts being made to disenfranchise voters after the fact. Right now, I don't know if the hearing is over, but there was a hearing in a Pennsylvania federal election lawsuit mounted by operatives that are seeking to cancel out ballots in Pennsylvania. There have been suits in Georgia, suits in Michigan. And what we see when we look at these lawsuits is one, that they're frivolous and baseless and desperate last-ditch efforts to change the outcome of the election. But many of these cases are singling out with almost surgical precision counties that are home to large numbers of voters of color. So while there are many who are kind of looking at this fight through a partisan lens, and I understand that, there's also a racial dynamic that I think you can't ignore. That there's this feeling by President Trump and his allies that the votes cast by voters of color are the ones that are easily up for grabs and that can easily be canceled out. And so we've intervened in a number of these cases to say, no, we know well the blood, sweat, and tears that were shed in order for people to have their voices heard this season, and we're not going to stand by and watch anyone try to cancel out those votes now. So it's a successful election season in some sense, but we can't ignore the just tremendous burdens that voters faced and endured, the painful barriers that people were up against in particularly in places that are home to large numbers of communities of color this season. I remember just talking about the sporting arenas. The sporting arenas were great, and we're excited about the partnership that we had with More Than a Vote. But gosh, I'm thinking about this one picture of a line that looped twice around Madison Square Garden. And for anyone who's been to New York City, you know that a New York City block is that's not a small loop. That is a long line to have to endure. And there's so many people who have children and jobs and just don't have the luxury of standing in line for 7-8 hours to cast their votes. And so I don't blame the use of the arenas. What I blame are the officials who just didn't make the calls right in terms of the number of sites that we would need, the number of options that voters would need this season. And Miles, if I can, I'll just close by referencing one of the questions that was posed by someone who talked about the tremendous expense, $50,000 that was paid for extra election expenses in their town. And will those costs now become kind of a permanent feature of how democracy works? And, the other dark layer to this story is the Senate's failure, their abject failure to pass a bill that many of us advocated for, that would have given jurisdictions the extra money that they absolutely needed to offer up more voting options, to put stamps on envelopes, to have more sites for early voting and primary voting and election day voting. So, the Senate's failure to act and respond to the pandemic is another kind of grim part of the story. Okay,
listen, I'm going to change gears just a little bit to go to the questions because we've got like a whole bunch of questions. So Chiraag and Alexis, let's do that. If that's okay? First question, and gives me an opportunity to do a little bit of a shout out. First of all, the question is from Archon Fung, who is the director of the democracy program and professor at the Kennedy School. And it's a question I wanted to ask. But also, you have a disembodied name of Tova Wang. Tova on the screen. Tova has been my partner in crime on a lot of this. And Tova, why don't you put your video on so we can have you join us? We did this event and every event together. So glad to see you.
Hi, everybody.
Right, so
I had not anticipated that.
But let's ask Archon's question. Archon's question is a key one, which is of the changes that have been made this year. Are they going to become? Are they likely to become permanent fixtures? Are state legislatures going to adopt them and continue to widen voters' options? I think I saw that in the state of Maine, they have already made the changes that they did for COVID permanent. But what's likely to happen? Chiraag, let me go to you first, and then we'll come back.
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, some of these were temporary measures. So like Missouri, for example, they expanded who could vote by mail. It used to be only certain classes of people who were, elderly or had underlying health conditions. And then they opened it up to everyone because COVID is a serious risk to everyone's health. So if we're hearing news about a vaccine, I'm certainly hopeful. I hope we have a vaccine. I hope that we can all go back to working outside of our homes from time to time and our kids going to school. That would also relieve some of the pressure. I'm hopeful that states will have appreciated this experience and how all of that early voting, the delivery of mail ballots to drop boxes, the use of the postal service. Obviously, there are problems there. Kristen covered them quite well. David touched them as well. But I am hopeful. I am also cautious about it. I'm cautiously hopeful because I think it's just undeniable that there is a partisan divide on issues of voter access right now. We saw that in full display this year with President Trump really leading the charge, and many, but not all Republicans, I think it's really important to say, joining in. There's a feeling, it appears to me on the Republican side, that when fewer people vote, they do better. When voters of color don't vote, they do better. When young voters don't vote, they do better. I'm hoping to see some analysis on that it does appear those groups vote more for Democrats, but I actually think Republicans have in some states been effective at using vote by mail. In Florida, they have a very sophisticated vote by mail operation. So I'm hoping we can break out of this partisan mold because it is just better for everyone. The other thing I just want to say here, I think there's some questions about, there was one from the UK, I think, about the United States being fascinating and maybe horrifying all at the same time because we have so many different election systems. It is a little crazy to me that the rules vary so much state to state. In some states, if you're going to vote by mail, just to take that example, you've got to get it in the day before election day, right? It's got to be received by election day. In other states, it can be postmarked by election day and received, 10 to 14 days later. In some states, you have ready access to drop boxes. In other states, you don't. In some states, you have 40 plus days of early voting. In some states, you have very little of that. And so I think we should have national standards. It's got to be a priority. HR 1, the For the People Act, would do that on early voting, on automatic voter registration, on same-day registration, on mail voting. And it would just be, I think, to the benefit of the country and our democracy if your right to vote and your access to the ballot didn't vary based on where you lived in the country.
David, do you want to comment on that? And also, let's roll in the question that was asked about funding. Do you think that, it is obvious that the election, which has been obvious for a long time, that the election system needs more funding in this country? Do you think it's likely to happen, and from where?
So on the funding issue, all I can say is there's work to do. I'm not going to make predictions about likely or not, but I think we're all committed to making sure that work is done. It's very clear more funding was needed. Kristen brought this up as well. Absolutely shameful that Congress did not act in a way to provide the necessary funding. There were virtually every election official in the country, doesn't matter whether they were liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans, asked for more funding. My organization, Center for Election Innovation and Research, received a grant from Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan to provide funding to help educate voters about changes in the process. And we gave tens of millions of dollars out to both red and blue states and everything in between to help them educate their voters. And that was a great success. But I got asked repeatedly, is this a good thing? Is this the way it should be done? That philanthropy is giving this money to the states? And I said, this is not plan A. This is plan A is that Congress and the state legislature step up and give election officials what they need to run effective elections. And we failed. And the way we've approached this ever since 2000 is that we've given, Congress has occasionally every 5 or 10 years gotten together and given some episodic, sporadic funding to the states for some purpose, but it was not sustained. And I think what we need to do in the future to make sure federal elections run smoothly is Congress does need to step up and provide some regular stream of funding that states can plan for, that they know will always be there, and they'll be able to hire staff to improve technology. That technology improvement is not just a one-time deal, although sometimes it is. There's a lot of technology that goes through constant upgrades, and to improve general practices of election administration. And so I couldn't agree more with that process. I think we will see some efforts to make some of the changes that we've seen sustainable long term. I think they're going to be wildly popular. And as we've pointed out, a lot of these changes were being contemplated even before the pandemic hit. So I think this is likely to be sustained. The partisan divide is not as broad as people think it is. Chiraag, you hit the nail on the head. There is this impression that turnout favors one party, low turnout favors a different party. I think this election hopefully will dispel that. That's not what happened in this election. Groups of voters are not monoliths that vote in one single way. And turnout is not an arrow pegged only towards one side of the political spectrum. And so making it easier to vote is going to be important. And I think we're going to see that. You look at states like Ohio, Florida, Georgia, which actually have pretty good options to vote early and by mail. And they're all run by Republicans. And I think we're going to see more efforts to kind of spread that across a bipartisan basis.
Speaking of funding, it seems like there was did you want to say something else, David? Alexis, I'm going to direct this to you. It seemed like there was also funding, obviously not governmental funding, but philanthropic funding and individual funding in the space of the organizations that were out there mobilizing and organizing. It seemed to me that there was a kind of real understanding in the philanthropic community that this stuff was important. Is that your sense as well, comparing to previous years?
Definitely. I mean, I think you always see an increase of funding during elections, right? We see this kind of boom bust cycle where there's huge investment during a federal election year, it kind of drops off, and during midterm it goes back up, then drops off, and it goes back up again. But this year, I mean, I think philanthropy stepped up in a huge way in order to, because they knew what was at stake, and that people needed more money than they even expected in order to make the shift. We needed, I mean, just like we had to triple, right, our budget in order to make sure that we even had the digital and tech tools that we needed in order to like pivot our entire programs, right? And so philanthropy, really, really tried to be as flexible as possible, right? So we could be responsive to the changing political landscape. They tried to make it as easy as possible to move funding without having to jump through a whole bunch of hoops, and really trusted the organizations and folks on the ground that were doing this work, and didn't try to be too, they didn't try to force us to use funding in a very specific way. And so, but even with that, well, I'll say two things. One, I think that it's sad that we needed that much philanthropic support to make sure that we were having an impact in our democracy, right? And I think that as folks are lifting up, you know, what is needed, and we talked about HR1, it's like we should be thinking about automatic voter registration across the entire country and universal voting. I mean, the amount of money and people's time and capacity that it takes just to make sure that people are having voice in our democracy is shameful for a democracy, I feel. And so I'm like, yes, philanthropy it was important, but it shouldn't have to be that important. And then the second thing I'll say is that, you know, we work year round. Like for us, the elections, yes, elections are important, but they're only one tactic, right? Voting is only one tactic in making sure that communities, especially communities who have been disenfranchised and oppressed, have a voice in the decisions that are impacting their lives and are building political power. And so what I am concerned about is as we now shift to 2021, as we shift to legislative sessions, as we shift to local elections, as we shift to issue organizing in states, as we shift to holding elected officials accountable, right? Will that same investment be there for the work and all of the capacity that was built up to do that work in states and at the local level? Will it be there for the digital infrastructure that we just built? Like we have to make sure that we're staying ready, that we're getting ready and staying ready as we move into 2022 and 2024. So I think that we just like raised the bar in some ways, and now we have to sustain it, not only for infrastructure, but to make sure that the people who were the decisive voters in this election and the people who are being most impacted, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, API, all people of color are invested in. And they're invested in year round, not just as a target for their vote.
Okay. So the question has come up from several questioners about the issue of federal standards. And I know that there's some debate about it. I mean, we are, I think, one of the only countries that doesn't have a national, election authority that sets the rules, et cetera. And we have a very decentralized system. The Election Assistance Commission, when it was set up under the Help America Vote Act, was called the Election Assistance Commission so that it wouldn't sound like it had any authority. Do you think that we should have stronger federal standards, and are we likely to have that discussion in a serious way going forward?
Maybe I'll jump in
okay.
on this one. So I think Bush v. Gore was a kind of pivot moment for us in democracy, right? I think it's a moment where the public's consciousness was really awakened to the ways in which our election system is broken. And I think the pandemic presents another pivot moment for us as a democracy. It just made so clear and has laid so bare how fractured our election system is. 50 states trying to figure this out, running elections, putting in place all kinds of rules and restrictions in any way that they deem appropriate. And we accept this because states do have some authority to set the time, manner, and place of elections. But Congress does have an underutilized power to regulate federal elections and to put in some baseline standards for our federal elections. And that power has been woefully underutilized. And we know that there were some bills this season that sought to make standard 2 weeks of early voting, that sought to put in place no excuse absentee balloting, that sought to do just some really basic things for federal elections. And it should not be the case that if you live in Texas and Tennessee, the barriers and burdens that you face are going to be 10 times greater than if you live in the state of Washington and Oregon. And that's literally America in 2020. So I don't think we should tolerate this anymore. And I think that an important project for us moving into the new year is not just securing final passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore life to our nation's most important federal civil rights law. And every day that we go by without the full protections of that act, we see the impact every day. But we also need Congress to act on just some of these baseline principles that should be across the board for all Americans in all 50 states. So the short answer is yes, and I hope that the pandemic will propel us forward in that regard. Instead, sadly, what we're hearing is that there are some states that may be embracing this moment to figure out how we can turn the clock back, how we can actually roll back access to mail voting and limit early voting. And I think that would be incredibly unfortunate.
Miles, can I add one thought here?
Sure.
So I spoke about this already, so I won't cover that same ground, but I just want to highlight one zone of danger that for me emphasizes why what Kristen said is so important about the need for federal legislation. We saw the emergence or the reemergence of a fairly radical legal theory in the courts just in the past couple of weeks, whereby those who were trying to get votes thrown out, and in particular the Trump campaign, argued to the federal courts that federal courts have a role to play in stopping state courts and other state actors from protecting the vote under state law, if those protections are in any way inconsistent with what state legislatures have done. It's a little hard to follow, but there are a couple of clauses in the Constitution that are the basis for this argument in the federal Constitution. And the argument is that state courts cannot, based on their own state constitutions, expand access to the vote by, say, declaring that a state legislature's statute is unlawful under the state constitution, because at least in federal elections, because any rules, according to this extreme theory, that govern federal elections have to be set by state legislatures themselves, and that only federal courts can have a check on that. That's extremely dangerous. It would take away state court strategies, civil rights strategies, including those that have been helpful in dealing with extreme partisan gerrymandering, which is not justiciable, not something you can sue in the federal courts over anymore, because John Roberts said you can't, and they got the votes, and so the Supreme Court said it's not possible. It is possible in state court, but this kind of radical legal theory where you cut state courts out of the process and everything goes to the federal courts, which have become increasingly hostile to voting rights claims, is dangerous. The way around it, if it does come to pass, if the Supreme Court says yes, they agree with this legal theory, is to pass sweeping federal legislation about voting rights rules, which, as Kristen said, Congress can do under the elections clause. That would sort of moot out a lot of these issues, because we would have clear, consistent, and expansive voter access rules at the federal level.
Great. But let me flip that a little bit, and this also responds to several questions about the potential role of states kind of as laboratories of democracy. I know for a while in the kind of election reform space, our feeling has been, gee, we're not going to get much out of the federal government. So the place to go is for states to get same-day registration and, widen the opportunities for voting and, get campaign finance reform. So how does it, are we torn about whether the feds should take more control or use the states as laboratories of democracy, and how do we balance it? David, you want to take a crack at that?
I've always been a big proponent of the state's approach. I've had a great deal of success with that. But to be honest, it also has been largely due to the fact that Congress was not fully functional. And by the way, I will just, I might be the minority here. This is not only one party that deserves 100% of the blame for this. I'm also not engaging in false equivalence and saying it's 50-50, but it is, there is some blame to go around in Congress. And I have basically thought that for the last 10 years, 15 years, maybe more, since HAVA probably, the chance of getting any kind of meaningful federal reform out of Congress that was actually useful and constructive was near zero. And we have seen a lot of great things going on in the states. Miles, you alluded to it earlier. I mean, the fact is there are more people who have access to same-day registration now than ever before. More people have access to automatic voter registration than ever before. 30 states are in ERIC, meaning the Electronic Registration Information Center, which resulted in tens of millions of people being invited to register this year, and more states have access to mail voting and early voting than ever before. Doesn't mean there isn't more work to do. Doesn't mean there aren't problems in many states, and there are. So for all that being said, I do think there could be a moment now for federal legislation. I don't think we're going to have a single federal kind of election in the sense that other countries do. And we have to also recognize that the fact that we have decentralization, there are a lot of negatives about that. There's also some positives. It makes our system very hard to hack. It makes our system very hard to leverage by foreign actors. And can you imagine if we had a single federal system right now that had happened to be using Dominion voting systems as their technology, which, by the way, all of the claims have been are completely debunked and are completely false. But if Dominion was used nationwide right now, what we might be dealing with. So I think there is some place for a natural balance between stronger federal standards that establish a floor and some standards for some things, some of which, by the way, Republicans might like better than Democrats. And I think that's a good thing if we can get to that point. And for still some room in the states to experiment beyond those things. I mean, a lot of great things that have come about in democracy have been because states experimented with them. Online voter registration came because Arizona experimented with that in the early part of this century. A lot of things about mail voting we've seen have come from states like Washington and Oregon. So allowing them some flexibility to go to above and beyond a federal floor and do better things is good. I am cautiously optimistic that this next year, and I always advocate for doing this in odd numbered years before political dynamics are set, that we could have a bipartisan conversation about how we want our federal elections to look and how we want to avoid the kinds of problems and delegitimization of that system that we're currently seeing.
Okay. All right. We're almost out of time, but I want to make sure, I want to hold true to my promise to give everybody, all the panelists, the last word. So, and we'll go back in reverse order. So Alexis, I'm going to come back to you for any final thoughts that you have that you want to make sure that we share with the 125 people that have been on this call. Speak again. All right, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to you. Okay. Kristen, let me go to you for final thoughts and comments.
So I'm hopeful that this post-election litigation circus ends very soon. We've seen a lot of these cases kind of fall by the wayside, quickly dismissed by courts. There's been kind of a rotating cast of lawyers. But, you know, I will say one thing. None of these lawsuits will change the outcome of the election. And what is the popular vote margin now? I think 5.5 million vote margin between the candidates. But I will say that the one thing I am hopeful for is that this puts to rest the mythology about vote fraud that has been lingering heavy over our conversations for quite some time. We've seen lawsuit after lawsuit after Election Day claiming fraud, and no evidence of it. Instead, what we've seen are U.S. Postal Service workers who falsely claimed that I was ordered to backdate ballots, and it turns out that that just wasn't true. We've seen people whine that they didn't get to observe. It turns out people were indeed allowed to observe from both parties, but they wanted to observe closer than 6 feet during a pandemic. These claims about vote fraud have stymied and stifled the efforts and reforms that we need to make the United States the modern democracy that it should be. And not a day longer should we tolerate a democracy where we ever fall short again below the 66% participation threshold that we hit in 2020. In fact, we just got to keep working on figuring out how we get that higher. And that is my hope. as we move into 2021 and as the dust settles from this, monumental election season.
Great.
And then there's the business of redistricting, but Miles, I know you'll bring us back together to wade into that political thing.
Yes, I suspect we'll have further conversations on these issues. I don't hear anybody saying it's time to sit back under a tree. Alexis, let's try to hear you again. No, we still can't hear you. Okay, Chiraag, we'll go to you.
Thanks, Miles.
Party
Yeah, I'm so proud of our country that we improved on previous elections. I'm thankful, as I said, for the heroic election officials and really on both sides of the aisle from both parties. I am extremely proud and inspired by organizers, Black and brown organizers, voters of color, formerly incarcerated people who organized to restore the right to vote and to turn out the vote from that community that has been much neglected and intentionally kept out of the process. So I am feeling inspired by how things went and the activity the way in which our community was able to show up. I also think we have a lot of work to do, and we just need to be able to hold both. We need to be able to hold some measure of celebration for the improvement, and then really, be able to be sober about the challenges that we've faced, and the consistent voter suppression and the voter fraud narrative, I think, is part of that. I mean, we saw extreme things, right? We saw a lawsuit to try to throw out 127,000 votes that were validly cast at drive-through voting locations in Texas. That's insane. No one should tolerate that in a democracy. So we have a lot of work to do. I know that there will be a lot of shifting of popular attention toward the new administration and a variety of different policies, but folks should just remember, democracy is necessary for any other policy that you care about, right? Access to the vote and expansive democracy policy is critical so that our policies reflect what the majority of people want in this country. I hope we can hold that as we go into policymaking in the next year.
Thanks,
Chiraag. That's great. Alexis, we'll give you one more try.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I had to call back in. It was my attempt to try to have the last word, So, just thinking about, just building off what David said, there's as you were talking about states versus federal, and if we can have bipartisan conversations in 2021. A quote by James Baldwin resonates with me at that moment, which is, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and in the denial of my humanity and right to exist. And I think that the fight for voting rights and the rights for people of color and Black folks in this country to have a voice, when we are the bedrock of democracy and the bedrock of the Democratic Party, is something that is, as you were lifting up bipartisanship, is something I, at this point, am not hopeful about, because it is such a contentious conversation. And in 2020, unfortunately, we still saw the majority of white people, we still in this country vote for a white supremacist agenda. And that's sitting with me, and I think it's sitting with a lot of people of color at this moment. What's bringing me hope, though, is that young people and so many new first-time voters of color came out in this election. And we keep hearing that Black men in the Latinx community voted at higher levels for Trump compared to 2016, which I think we have to interrogate more. But the story that that I am seeing and that I am lifting up is that we saw more first-time voters of color being engaged, and that were activated because of the racial justice uprisings, because of economic security, because they saw voting as a strategy to fight against white supremacy, right? And voters, and specifically young voters and voters of color, are strategic, right? They understood at a visceral level what this moment meant in our long-term fights for civil rights and freedom in this country. And it was because of the organizations doing the work in states across this country that made it possible. It was not the political campaign. And then the last thing I'll say, there's a lot of questions about Georgia. We don't have time to get into it, but Georgia needs your help. I'm going to put in our person who's organizing volunteers in the chat. So if you're interested in being a poll monitor, helping to train people in doing voter education, I mean, this is like a rapid response over the next few weeks, right? We need to get people registered. We need to get them starting to turn out to early vote December 16th or December 14th, right? The runoff's on January 5th. And so we need all hands on deck for this moment. So I'm going to put information if you are interested in learning more, or how you or anyone you know can volunteer in this moment, please do. So thank y'all.
Great. All right. Well, this was a great conversation. I really want to thank you. I want to, and yes, we will have more. I want to do a quick shout out to the terrific ASH team, James Roche, Melissa Danello, and Sarah Grucha, who helped make all of this work seamlessly. Tova and I are already planning our next event, December 15th, and it's going to be on the prospects of election reform going forward, both at the federal and state level. We'll probably, unfortunately, have to have some different panelists, but you're all certainly welcome to join us again. And on behalf of ASH Center, I want to thank all of you. You did a great job. This was a really great conversation, and we'll have more of them as the days and months go along. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for taking your time. And thanks to the audience for hanging in.